by Tracy Chapman. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. We're broadcasting on over 950 stations, on Pacifica and NPR, on college and community stations, on public access TV and PBS TV stations, and both TV satellite networks, on Dish Network Channel 9415 Free Speech TV, and on Link TV Channel 375. We are also broadcasting on DirecTV, Channel 375 and Channel 348, and we're video and audio podcasting at democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. Our guest for the hour is Michael Moore. His new book is Here Comes Trouble, Stories from My Life. Your early years, Michael. Why did you choose to write this book?
I decided to write this book because I like to read short stories. And I've always wanted to write a book of short stories, and I thought, why don't I just start with not made-up stories, but the ones from my own life, because I had a very interesting, to put it mildly, life before I was a filmmaker, before anybody knew who I was. So
your parents didn't even know?
Well, no, my parents, my parents knew very well, actually, and perhaps maybe encouraged it on some level, because my mother had made the mistake of teaching me to read and write by the time I was 4. So I was already doomed at that point as soon as I entered school. And also, as I remember it, it was asking questions was an okay thing in our household. So as a little tyke, that was not put out. The flame of that was not extinguished. So,
though it did get you kicked out of seminary, didn't it?
Well, by the time I was in 9th grade, I was very enamored, inspired by the Berrigan brothers, the two priests who had led anti-war protests, who committed acts of civil disobedience against the war, and also the whole Catholic community around Cesar Chavez, and at that time there were a lot of these radical priests, and there was one actually in our parish, and so I thought, well, this is what I want to do. But of course, I'm 14 years old, so I turned 15 while I went away to the seminary in the first year. And the priests there were probably not that pleased with me, again, because I was asking all these questions, why this, why that. And the Catholic Church is not an institution where you want to ask a lot of questions. So anyways, by the end of that year, between that and the fact that the, normal hormones had kicked in, and I read the rule book and figured this probably wasn't the best place to be for a teenager, I went in to tell them I wasn't coming back, and I sat down before I had a chance to say anything. The Father DeWicki said to me, we're asking you to leave and not come back. And I said, wait a minute, you can't fire me. I'm quitting. He said, well, great, we're in agreement. So for once, anyway, so that was the end of my my years as a potential Catholic priest. Talking
about illustrious Catholics, can you talk about your encounter with Bobby Kennedy? How old were you?
I was 11 years old. My mother's idea of a summer vacation was not to take us up to the lake to go, fishing and swimming and all that. She convinced my dad that we should go to Washington, D.C., or Civil War battlefields, or places like that to learn American history. So she'd load us kids in the car. We'd drive from Flint, Michigan, down to our nation's capital, where we would spend days at the National Archives reading the documents, or at the Smithsonian and walking through all their exhibits. And taking us up to Capitol Hill because she thought it was important for us to meet our elected representatives from Michigan. So one day we're in the Capitol building, and I got separated from them. And I'm wandering around, and I'm 11 years old, and then I start to realize I'm never going to see my parents again. And so I see an elevator, the doors open. I walk into this elevator. I'm in tears. And there's a man reading the newspaper in the elevator. The doors close. He hears this little boy crying. He puts the paper down. I turn around. It's Bobby Kennedy. And he's like, what's wrong, young man? And I lost my mommy. So he we got off the elevator and he took me to go find my mommy. And he ran into a Capitol police officer, and the officer said, "It's okay, Senator, we'll take it from here." And he said, "No, I'll stay with him until you find the mother." And he stayed there and comforted me, and had this conversation with him, and it was a very sweet thing for him to do. It's something that just I held for many years after that.
Did you know who Bobby Kennedy was?
Yes, of course. The time? Yes, I was Irish Catholic. Yes, I would have known if I was 5 years old. So, yes, and of course this would have been. This is really just a year and a half after his brother's assassination. So. Well, very affected by this. Everybody was affected, and certainly you're going to Catholic school. You were really affected by this. In the country's entire history, only one Catholic had been elected president, so it was a big deal. So yes, I knew exactly who it was, and I was grateful for him being there.
Now, you were a Catholic who was elected as well, one of the youngest people to run for office in this country.
Yes, right after 18-year-olds got the right to vote. I was still a senior in high school, and we had this very brutal vice principal who carried this wooden board around and gave swats to students whenever he felt like it. And he gave it to me one day, made me bend over because my shirt tail was out. You had to have your shirt tucked in back then. And I was just so upset. I went home and I saw in the paper that 2 school board members were retiring and there was going to be an election in June. And I started thinking, geez, I wonder if I could run for office and be this guy's boss. So I called the county clerk and found out I could run. I got the required number of signatures and I ran.
Well, wait a second. How many signatures did you need?
Well, actually, that was when they said I had to get all these signatures. I'm thinking I had to get thousands of names to run, and I was a young man filled with a lot of lethargy, so I was not inclined to want to go door to door and getting signatures. And the county clerk said, "No, you only need 20." And I said, 20? And he said, "Yeah, 20." And I'm thinking, geez, I know 20 stoners who will sign anything. So I got the petitions. Within an hour, I got my 20 signatures. I was on the ballot. And, I was a senior in high school. I had kind of long hair. And the Republicans in town were just, oh, my God, this hippie's going to be on the school board. So a whole bunch of them go and get petitions to run also to try and stop me. But it made no sense because they would just split the adult vote. Which is what they did. 6 of them ran against me, and I won with a plurality of votes, and I became one of the first 18-year-olds in the country elected to public office.
So what did you do with this trusty charge of the public?
Well, the first position on my platform was to get the vice principal fired.
Wait, you were both the student at the time and his boss?
Yes. For the last week of school, I was one of his bosses, and I was under fear of being hit with that board. So it was an odd situation, and frankly, it was very. I had quite an epiphany in line for graduation, at my high school graduation. It was the night of June 17th, 1972, which coincidentally was also the night of the Watergate break-in. But we didn't know anything about that because we were just in line to.
You definitely weren't involved.
I was not involved. Knew nothing about it.
Though you were a Nixon admirer.
Well, yes. When I was 14, when Nixon was running against Humphrey, I was so upset at Johnson and Humphrey for this war that my 14-year-old brain just couldn't process anything other than I'm not going to vote for these guys, or I wouldn't vote for these guys. And Nixon, if people remember, he said he had a secret plan to end the war, and we'd be out of there in 6 months, and that sounded good to me. So I was just this little tyke going door to door and putting up posters for Richard Nixon. Of course, again, as I became older as a teenager, my views on him quickly changed once he got elected. It was one of the kind of early sort of, oh wow, they don't actually tell the truth, nor do they have to, and. But I was very much against the war. That's all that really mattered to me at that age. And if you said you were going to stop the war, that was good enough for me. But I was 14 years old.
But moving ahead a few years, 4 years to this elected position that you had. So you get the vice principal fired as his boss and the one who's going to be threatened by his paddle. These school board meetings, you recorded them?
Well, you know, I started getting misquoted in the local paper, you know, because I would make motions to do certain things that I thought would make the schools better, give students more rights. We had an elementary school that needed a name, and so I proposed that we named it Martin Luther King Elementary School. Of course, it was an all-white school, and, you know, you're only supposed to name black schools Martin Luther King schools. And I just thought, well, I think this would be good actually for these white kids to go to a Martin Luther King school. And oh my God, the town just went nuts, and they started a recall election. And so I brought my tape recorder into the meetings just so I could record the public meetings. And they reached over and they turned it off. They said, you can't record these meetings. I said, well, this is a public meeting. No, you can't do that. And they passed them like a rule saying that nobody could record the public meetings. And so the next meeting, all the press showed up. Everybody put their tape recorder on the table, and people brought cameras, and it just descended from there. So,
talk about high school graduation.
Well, yes, I was. Yes, so I started to say that. So I was in line for graduation, and boys had to wear a tie under their gown. So this vice principal, he's going down the line, you know, checking under everybody's gown to make sure they have a tie on, and this kid in front of me, the assistant principal stops and he goes, "Where's your tie?" And he says, "Oh, I have a tie." And he had one of those string ties. Bolero, yes. And he says, "This is a tie." And he said, "This is not a tie." And he yanks the kid, physically, takes him out of the line and says, "You're not graduating." And he's going, "But Mr. Ryan," and he says, "Out." And he just takes the kid and just out to the door. And that was it. 12 years of going to school, and the kid couldn't graduate because he had on the wrong kind of tie. But the real thing that bothered me about that wasn't so much what Mr. Ryan did to this student.
He didn't graduate.
He did not graduate. That's right. That's right. But I stood there. And I had just been elected 5 days earlier to the Board of Education. I stood there and said nothing. I and all the other students, nobody said anything, nobody objected. And I was so bothered by that. And then I heard from the boy's mother the next day, and she called me and crying, and I'm just like, why? And she said, "Why didn't you say anything?" And I said, "Well, I was still a student." She said, "But you're also on the school board." And I thought, wow. This is the way it usually is. I didn't want to risk me not being able to graduate. You know, so I turned the other way. You know, I didn't want to stick my neck out because it might get chopped off. And that's really how we're trained. I mean, we're trained from an early age, the system, the society, the schools, whatever, that wants to make sure that we don't upset the apple cart too much. And I felt so bad about myself after that, and I said to myself, that's the last time you're going to remain silent. You see somebody being picked on like that, you see something that's wrong, it's just wrong. You have to say something no matter what. And so it really, at 18 years old, it had a real, but don't you think though in our lives it's sometimes those small things, those little incidents that really have profound implications for us in terms of how we're formed and how we sort of decide to live. You know, when you were born, you didn't come out of your mother on the day you were born and say, I will someday, you know, host a show called Democracy Now! Although you may have, I don't know, I shouldn't say that, but you were formed by the experiences that you had, things that you saw, things that bothered your conscience, and you became who you became as a result of that. And I think we're all like that, and I think we all have stories like that to tell.
Talk about your parents, what they did.
My dad was an assembly line worker at AC Sparkplug, which was a division of General Motors, and his job was to build and then inspect the little spark plugs as they came off the line. My mom was a secretariat clerk in a township office, and you know, they had a middle class life. They were able to, by working 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, My dad had 4 paid weeks in the summer of vacation time. We had 100% health coverage, dental coverage, all of this. That was a time when you could, the children of factory workers could actually look forward to going to college. And this was really a first in history, because the children of the working class never really aspired or thought about going to college. But that was something that happened in that generation after World War II. And so I was very lucky to have that kind of life, and to have parents who really encouraged me to follow my conscience and stand up and say what I thought was right, and be willing to take the consequences for it, but be who you think you are.
I want to play a quick clip from Roger and Me, that first film that took the world by storm. But just before we get to it, what led to it? You being the editor of the Flint Voice, and what that meant.
What led to me making Roger and Me?
And Flint Voice.
And my own. Yes, I have my own newspaper. I started a paper called the Flint Voice. I ran this for almost 10 years in Flint.
How old are you?
Oh, geez, I was 22, something like that. And I've always loved journalism, and I started my first newspaper when I was in 4th grade, and the nuns, they shut it down. So then I started one in the neighborhood, and the neighbors got upset. I was listing people's homes for sale and just coming up with prices that.
What were you exposing?
I was really just exposing why our sports teams weren't doing very well. It wasn't anything hugely political at that time, but it was just, I couldn't understand why I couldn't even write about that it was just so tightly controlled. The more they tried to control it, the more I started up a paper again in 6th grade, they shut that down. I started up again in 8th grade, they shut that down.
When did the police raid your paper?
Well, then I started the Flint Voice, and we did a story on the mayor and how he was having city employees campaign for him on city time, and he was using federal funds to pay these employees, essentially to campaign for him. And so we did a story on it. He wanted to know where we got the story, and we wouldn't tell him. And so he sent the police to our printer, which was at another newspaper, and they, with a search warrant signed by a judge, went in there and seized everything to do with our paper, including the printing plates right off from the press. And it was just a shocking thing. And it became national news. And then a few months later, there was another newsroom raid out in Boise, Idaho, of a CBS affiliate, where they went to snatch some videotapes of a demonstration. After these 2 incidents with my paper and the local TV station in Boise, a number of congressmen got behind and then passed a newsroom shield law that prohibited police from going into newsrooms to seize things. And that became the law of the land. Jimmy Carter signed it, and it had its origins in part from this raid that occurred in Flint, Michigan, with my little paper.
I want to go on to Roger and Me and go beyond as well. We're talking to Michael Moore for the hour. He has just written a new book. Michael Moore, the provocateur laureate, the best-selling author, the Oscar-winning filmmaker. His book, Here Comes Trouble, Stories from My Life. Stay with us.